In the last module, we went over some of the basic foundations that are useful for understanding how archaeologists have investigated various aspects of civilization in the past. In this module, we turn our attention more specifically to incipient agricultural societies in North, Central, and South America. These areas are very, very different from each other. In the interactive map, which was presented in the in the foundation section, I asked you to actually look at the map and investigate how different the topography is. So what you're looking at right now are the eastern woodlands. This area is considered the eastern woodlands of North America. And along the major rivers, you have incipient agricultural societies that started. We know that because we have a lot of sites that have yielded botanical specimens that show us samples of seeds, nuts, and other kinds of plant remains that have gone from being wild versions, usually much smaller in size, to much larger in size. So if you want to investigate the beginnings of sunflower domestication, then you have to actually find wild versions of those plant seeds, and have another layer at a site, a more recent layer at a site, in which the botanical specimens that were recovered actually are different, morphologically as well as genetically different. Some of you, for your essays and or your annotated bibliographies, may in fact choose to look at the process of domestication of a specific species, and you can choose North America if you would like. But the sites that you will be examining are along major river systems, and that's simply because many of the plants that were domesticated in the eastern woodlands are in fact very marshy plants. They grow along riverways. Oops, sorry about that. In Central America, which I will try to get up here right now. So Mesoamerica really encompasses Mexico all the way down through this area here. And what you have is high topical relief, very, very mountainous and very lush and moist environments in this area. And then here in Mexico, you have a very dry, arid kind of climate. This is the area in which corn was domesticated. It's a grass. Grasses like to grow in very dry environments. They thrive as ground cover. So it's not surprising that in a very dry, arid area, you would actually have something like a grass being domesticated. That's certainly what happened in the Middle East. Down in Amazonia, oops, going the wrong way. Please bear with me here. I'm new to this technology. In South America, you have other domestications that occurred. This very dry, extremely high relief area along the Pacific coastline of South America is where the potato was domesticated, along with quinoa. It is quite a very harsh environment in many ways, and it's not surprising that a tuber might actually have been domesticated in such a climate. And of course, quinoa, once again, is one of these grasses, very prolific and very dry, arid kinds of climates. And then we have the Amazon. So in this area here, we know now that other kinds of plants were domesticated. The nature of domestication in Amazonia is really interesting. This is a limestone base geology. That means that at some point in the past it was an ocean, it was water under there, on top of it, and as a result, there's not a lot of topsoil. So when you go to the Amazon, it's very lush. There are enormous river systems, but it's it doesn't have a very deep topsoil. And that's why when agriculturalists do their slash and burn farming, it really has a real impact on the soil, the quality and the fertility of the soil. So we know archaeologically that there were extensive canal systems and raised field systems throughout Amazonia. In fact, I may actually be looking at one right now, maybe not. These areas were where we find these raised fields and also what they call terra preta soils. These are man-made soils created thousands of years ago in some cases, in other cases just hundreds of years ago, but a very effective way of creating much deeper soils in which to grow crops. And in these areas, they find a lot of what they call patchy resources. So we know that people were really more inclined towards what they call arboriculture. That means tree-based crops. So you have things like fruits that are raised in tree orchards. A lot of nuts are raised in tree orchards, and a lot of these orchard patches that are found throughout the Amazon are areas that were created by people a very, very, very long time ago. Early agricultural societies are really interesting to study because this slide shows the correlation between social organization and the kind of society that existed. You'll see the very first column it's entitled Mobile Hunter-Gatherer Groups. And if you look down the left, you will see it gives you different aspects of that society. So we know from ethnographic work that was done in the 20th century that hunter-gatherer groups are never more than 100 people. They may have moments during the year, seasonal moments, where a large number of these people will get together and they'll have rituals and ceremonies, and they will look for mates, new spouses for their children. But in general, they don't exist in groups of more than 100. They're very egalitarian in organization. That means that nobody can really tell another person what to do. Their economic organization is essentially what the name says. They're mobile hunter-gatherers. They move across the landscape. They exploit different kinds of resources at different times of the year. They don't have houses. They often make temporary kinds of structures. For example, in North America, we know that people made teepees. We know that other people made wigwams. So they have these very temporary kinds of shelters. They don't have any kind of formal religion. They tend to be animistic in their religious ideology. That is, they think that they believe that inanimate objects have spirits. And they tend to leave very ephemeral traces on the landscape. So when we have this transition to agriculture in the Americas, we know that we are looking for people who all of a sudden are starting to settle down. They're not moving around as much. And that is, in fact, what happens towards the end of what we refer to as the terminal archaic or the late archaic period. People start to settle down. They start to domesticate plants, and as they're doing that, they start to rely more heavily on these particular resources. So you have a new kind of group. It's not listed in this table, but it's referred to as sedentary complex hunter-gatherer groups. Very big term, but essentially what it means is these hunter-gatherers are not moving around as much. They're depending more on plant resources, and they are starting to domesticate plants and animals. The next column over is entitled Segmentary Society. This is really what we're looking for when we're trying to investigate early agricultural societies. Segmentary society simply means that people have started to settle into villages. They will have a regional sense of belonging to each other. You'll have a linear group of villages, usually along some kind of a waterway. And these people have a very low level of political or social organization. They recognize each other, usually because they're dressed the same way, they have the same kind of stuff, the same kinds of artifacts. They speak the same language. They tend to have the same religious ideology. But they don't have really any kind of hierarchy in terms of the settlement. That is, there's not a central place. Central place settlements are something that really developed very at the end of the Archaic period into what we refer to as the Woodland period. Now, in North America, that type of social organization eventually leads into what we refer to as chiefdoms. But when you look down in Central America and in South America, it seems that the level of social complexity accelerated in those areas much faster than it did in North America. And that may simply be a reflection of the fact that they developed crops that they could store and support people over many, many years, whereas in the eastern woodlands, although the kinds of domesticated plants that they raised were very rich in fats and oils and in proteins, nonetheless, they did not have that kind of storability that corn and potatoes and quinoa and other kinds of crops had. So I think that the ability to have a huge reservoir of food that could last over several years actually gave them an edge and allowed for them to develop social inequality on a greater scale than in North America. We'll pick up this graph again in the next module, but I just want to scroll down here and let me just back up and say that this is taken from the PowerPoint presentation that I posted under the Foundations module, but it's something that we need to keep coming back to over and over again because it has great relevance to what we're talking about. So what you see here, once again, this is just to reinforce the relationship between the kinds of foods that people rely on and the level of social complexity that we find in the archaeological record. So on the far left, you have a dividing line, a red line that separates simple technology to increasing complexity, and underneath the bar is bands and tribes. So hunter-gatherers, they simply never have any kind of a surplus. They're not able to really differentiate themselves in any great way. That's why you don't have real leaders in hunter-gatherer societies that are running around commanding people to actually do things. The minute you start to have people settling down into villages and having pastoralists and horticulturalists, that is small-scale subsistence farmers, you start to have a lot of new things that happen. You have to have greater social complexity. All of a sudden, people have a sense of ownership of stuff. Not only stuff, they have a sense of owning the land. If you happen to have a particularly fertile piece of land, you're inclined to defend that from other people. If you are a society that has domesticated animals, such as they did in the Andes, you have the domestication of the llamas and alpacas. You're going to defend those resources from other people coming along. And over time, as we'll see in the next module, you have what's called intensified agriculture. And once you have intensified agriculture, you have the basis for what we refer to as complex society. That means that all of a sudden you have enormous surpluses. You have people who are extremely differentiated from each other socially. Some people will be specialists, some people will be politicians, others will be religious leaders, and you start to have people who are able to command you to work for them. All of a sudden you have command over large labor forces, and that's why you start to get really, really complex architecture.